Hello, everyone. This is Parrish Alford with the Daily Journal. I'm joined by Logan Lowery, our Mississippi State beat writer, and this is Double Coverage, a production of the Daily Journal. We're going to talk all things Mississippi State and Ole Miss for the next half hour or so. Logan, how are you, man?
I'm doing good. I had a long day yesterday. Got up and started with your hours a little bit yesterday morning. Got up and did some deer hunting. First time I've been in the woods all deer season. You know, the state's bowl game kind of messed up my plans to go do some deer hunting during the month of December. So just now got a chance to get in the woods, and it was a bad day yesterday to try to do it. It's just the first opportunity that I've had. It got up into the 70s and was kind of raining, and just really wasn't a good day. I didn't see anything to shoot. I saw 3 turkeys, a squirrel, and a rabbit. So not exactly what I was hunting, but still a good day to enjoy the outdoors. And maybe I'll get a chance to go out next week when the weather is more kind of conducive to deer hunting.
Logan, I think the best hunting has to be done on the Natchez Trace from Highway 82 on up to Tupelo at about 11 o'clock at night. I mean, that's when I see more deer than any other time. If you could just drive down the trace with your headlights on, you could pick them off, because I counted about 40 the last time I made that run.
Yeah, and I just really don't want to go to jail when I go hunting. That's kind of what would happen. But I was over in Alabama doing some hunting, and may try to scout out a couple of more places to try to go between now and next week.
Hey, folks, lots to talk about in the program today. Before we get started, I want to remind you to check out The Memo, our news podcast, all things Northeast Mississippi. That comes to you every Wednesday and Friday. And be sure to check out Prep Rally for all your high school sports needs. That comes out every Wednesday. Logan and I are here with you Thursday or Friday, depending on schedules and what's going on with double coverage. Logan, I've been working on a couple of stories about the booster culture at Ole Miss. Want to talk about that in a little bit. I guess the most asked question that I've had since the NCAA findings were released on that first Friday in December was, how is Ole Miss going to deal with its boosters? How is it working to improve that situation? And got a few answers, not just a lot of specifics out there, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Before we get there, Logan, Mississippi State and Ole Miss women played last night in Starkville. I know you were there. Not surprisingly, a lopsided win for the Bulldogs. Let's talk about that game a little bit. What did you see?
Well, it started off all Mississippi State. In fact, State jumped out to a 14-0 on a 14-0 run just to start off the game. Blair Schaefer hit a couple of threes, took a charge on the other end, and then they kind of went to work with Tierra McCowan. I think she scored 6 straight points. And like I said, before you know it, Mississippi State's ahead 14-0. And Matt Insel called a timeout during that run and really just didn't do any good. Ole Miss finally got its first basket about 5 minutes into the game on a little putback shot up under the basket. And, Ole Miss actually made a run before halftime, actually made it a little competitive. State was up 22-9 after the first quarter. And but Ole Miss was able to get Tierra McCowan and Victoria Vivians, Mississippi State's top 2 scorers, got them both into foul trouble before halftime. So they had to sit most of that second quarter, and Ole Miss went on a little run and were able to close the score a little bit before halftime, and kind of held State without a basket for the final 5 minutes of the first half. And only a couple of Morgan Williams free throws right before the half was the only points Mississippi State scored in the last 5 minutes. So Ole Miss had a little bit of a chance, came out of the second half. Shelby Gibson hit a 3-pointer to start off the second half, and Ole Miss was able to cut the lead down to 7, but that was as close as it got. Mississippi State turned things on, went to Tierra McCowan a lot. Down low, she had a big night, ended up with 25 points, 13 rebounds. Victoria Vivians had 15 points, Blair Schaefer with 14. Mississippi State ends up rolling 76-45. Ole Miss just really didn't share the basketball very well. They only had 4 assists on the night, and Medina Muhammad was the only Rebel in double figures with 14 points. I know they're missing Chandrika Sessom a lot. They're all-league guard. But it was just kind of all Mississippi State from the jump the other night or last night. And, it's kind of what's happened in that series. The Mississippi State's won. I think that was their 8th straight win in the series. their 11th straight in Starkville. So State's dominated the series as of late, but they got a lot of room to catch up because Ole Miss dominated really when that series got started. Ole Miss won like 20-something straight to start that series.
You know, Logan, when I was covering Mississippi State back in the day, I remember that series record. And at a time, the series was 50-1 in Ole Miss's favor. Now, you know, it may, you know, the Bulldogs may catch up, but I thought even then, 50-1, you just don't see two teams playing consistently in any sport that reaches that level of you know, that kind of gap there in the series. But 50-1, so the Rebels still lead the series. Look, this is not a very athletic Ole Miss women's basketball team right now. I've watched them a couple of times this year. The loss of Sessom is very big because they just don't have very much depth there. So they're really missing her. And, you know, particularly in the post, they have some good players, but they are, you know, players like Promise Taylor, who really has to, you know, have good position and has to catch the ball in position to shoot and things like this. Just not really the quickness and athleticism that Mississippi State has in the post, I know. But you mentioned, Logan, that the Rebels were able to get the Bulldogs in foul trouble with Vivians and McCowan having to sit out a little bit. And we've talked about this somewhat before. Is that a weakness of this Mississippi State team when it starts trying to make a deep NCAA run, when it starts playing elite teams on a nightly basis in the tournament? Is the depth going to be a problem?
It's going to be more of an issue than it was a year ago. It's not as much of an issue as it was earlier in the season. They've been able, in all these blowout wins that they've been getting, they've gotten a lot of their backups into the game to play extended minutes, and they're better than they were. They're not the, you know, same scoring presence that they have when they have McCowan and Vivians on the floor, but they do have players that can score. I mean, Ro Johnson had kind of an off night last night, but she's capable of putting up big numbers from beyond the arc. Blair Schaefer is as well. Morgan Williams has proven she can score with the best of them when she needs to, but that's really kind of hasn't been her role on the team this year. She's kind of been a facilitator and just kind of taking what the defense gives them. But you know, other than that, you know, behind them, I mean, Chloe Bibby's had some big games. She's had some freshman moments as well. Zion Campbell is obviously not the presence that McCowan is inside, but she had 3 blocks last night against Ole Miss. She's 6'3", you know, and she didn't really play a whole lot last year as a redshirt freshman. She's coming into her sophomore year this year, and she's giving them some good minutes off the bench. McCowan is actually in a lot better cardiovascular condition than she was a year ago, so she can get up and down the floor for most of the ball game. She doesn't really need that much time on the bench to catch her breath, but when she does, Zion Campbell gives them really good minutes. You know, obviously Mississippi State's a better team with McCowan on the floor. But another thing I'll say about last night's game is you didn't see the rant by Matt Insel after the game. I think a lot of people were kind of looking forward to that. He said some crazy things in that Mississippi State post-game press conference before in Starkville. But last night he was kind of more reserved. He was losing his mind during that 14-0 run to start the game, but he was more reserved. He actually said he wasn't going to go on a rant, you know, when he was in the press conference. But I thought he handled himself very well and just kind of said that this team needs to grow up. They didn't have the same experience that Mississippi State does, and he's right. You know, looking at their roster, they had a lot of freshmen and sophomores coming in and out of the game. So it's a young team and probably just going to get better.
Well, maybe so, but at the end of the day, you can be young, but you need to be athletic, and that's just not where they are right now. Tell me, Logan, what is the level of support for the Mississippi State women's basketball team as it relates to the men? I mean, I've been around teams, I've been around colleges before where the women's team just takes on a personality of its own and really, you know, has the greater level of support from students, from fans and things of that nature. And obviously the Bulldogs themselves, the men have improved this year, but where do the fans fit in here? Who do they give most of their attention to?
The women, and it's a change in culture. I mean, you remember when you covered them, and especially when I started covering Mississippi State, Rick Stansberry had that place packed out. I mean, they had the moniker the toughest ticket in town, and that was true. I mean, it was tough to get a ticket for most of the SEC games. I mean, they would pack that hump out, and it would be rowdy, a loud atmosphere, and that's not the case anymore. That program's been through a lot over the last 4 or 5 years. You know, Rick Ray, the final season of Stansbury, Ben Howland's tenure thus far, there just really hasn't been that draw. And the women have kind of taken on a spurt over the last few years, and I think a lot of the fan support has gone towards the women. I mean, last night they had 7,100 in the hump for an 8 o'clock tip on a rainy night, you know, in Starkville. So it just really wasn't great conditions, and they packed that place out last night for a women's game. That's more than the men have drawn all season. It's probably more than the men will draw. And even with the record that State has right now, they're undefeated at home. They haven't lost a game in the hump all season. But Saturday, you know, they play Auburn. There won't be that many people there because they've just lost interest. You know, for whatever reason, they haven't been able to kind of capture the fans. You know, they saw through the soft schedule that Mississippi State played in the non-conference, and just as soon as State lost a couple of games, they lost to Cincinnati. You know, the fans turned on them. They lost at Ole Miss last Saturday. The fans turned on them, and then they lost again at Florida Tuesday night. So the fans just really, for whatever reason, haven't drawn towards the men, and they've drawn their attention towards the women.
Now, I thought Ole Miss in that game last Saturday, Logan, kind of responded better to the Mississippi State defense late in that game. It's almost like they were hesitant or reluctant early on. But even Breein Tyree basically said this after the game, the sophomore point guard for Ole Miss. You know, he watched and he saw some success that DeAndre Burnett was having in getting to the rim. And all of a sudden that gave him a little more confidence to do that. And, his big shots late were the difference in that game. That kind of kept the Bulldogs at arm's length, and Ole Miss was able to win that game 64-58. Tyree has become the Rebels' best player the last few games. Last 3 games, he's averaging 19 points, really seeing a little more consistency from the type of player we saw him become last season. So, look, we've talked about this Ole Miss team with a lot of guards. Somebody needs to step up, and frankly, Tyree looks to be the best candidate right now. Terrence Davis has backslidden. He's underachieving right now, not playing nearly as well in SEC play as he was during the pre-conference schedule. He reached SEC play, Logan, averaging 16.1 points. He's still their most explosive player, their player with greatest potential on offense, because he can also shoot from three-point range. But when conference play began, and it wasn't like the Rebels were playing a bunch of dogs in the non-conference. Now they played a challenging schedule, and Davis played well against it. But when conference play started, it's like he went into a shell. Going into the 85-70 loss at Auburn on Wednesday, Davis was 4 for 28 from the floor in 3 SEC games. He was a little better against Auburn, not much. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but he's a guy that they really need to get on a roll if they're going to achieve anything this season. Honestly, Tyree is their best player, their best guard right now. Burnett's been really steady. He didn't play against Auburn with flu-like symptoms. He made the trip as they traveled around to different group activities. He was wearing a surgical mask to try and protect himself and others, but he did make that trip. He will play against Florida tomorrow at noon. That's a game that, look, I don't want to talk too much about RPI and NCAA chances, because this team is far, far away from that conversation right now. But if Ole Miss is going to achieve anything with the remainder of this season, it's going to need Terrence Davis to play better, to score better. It's going to need continued improvement defensively, and we were seeing that from the Rebels before the second half against Auburn. So maybe they'll get back to that against Florida. But they've got to win the Florida game. They've got to protect home court in SEC play. They didn't do that in the non-conference. They lost 3 non-conference home games. Very unusual for Andy Kennedy's Ole Miss teams, but they lost to Illinois State, South Dakota State, and then Virginia Tech, which, you kind of kind of expect. But even in that game, they had a big lead and let it get away in the second half. All three of those losses came in overtime. So it's not like they weren't competitive, but they are losses on the record, and that's going to really hinder their resume. Usually you build that resume in non-conference and try and get over the hump during SEC play. That's kind of been the MO for Kennedy's Ole Miss teams. A couple of times they were able to do that, but not lately. They had a run there where they made the NCAA tournament 2 times in 3 years, in 13 and 15. But they haven't done that in a while now. They haven't even been close. And that's kind of the conversation that Ross Bjork had with Kennedy at the end of last season when he chose not to extend Kennedy's contract. He wants to see this basketball program in the conversation for the NCAA tournament on Selection Sunday. He wants to see these guys wake up and either know they are in the tournament or know that, hey, they're really close, and if a couple of things break, they could get there. I mean, that's the level that he wants to see from this basketball program, and it's not there. Hadn't been there the last couple of years. Doesn't look like it's going to be there this year. So that's why this is a big year for Andy Kennedy, his 12th at Ole Miss. Rebels taking on Florida tomorrow at noon. The return of Mike White, the former player and assistant, so that's always interesting. Still a very popular person around Oxford. Wanted to talk a little bit, Logan, about booster culture at Ole Miss. I've done a couple of stories on that. Again, the most asked question of me since the NCAA findings were released was, or has been, how is Ole Miss going to deal with booster culture? That was the central theme in the NCAA's findings, were that there was too much booster interaction, boosters doing the wrong things, inserting themselves into the program and the recruiting, lots of charges against the boosters. Now, the Ole Miss administration, Jeff Vitter and Ross Bjork, strongly disagree with the NCAA's assessment in the sense that the NCAA went back to the 80s to make this claim, to try and strengthen its argument. So, Bjork has said many times, when do you have a clean slate? You do the right thing, from the previous experience. When does the slate, turn over? And they disagree with the NCAA going back so far to try and make its case. They believe for many years they did run a clean program. They acknowledge the issues that came to light during the NCAA investigation. Now, back to the boosters. How do you deal with this, Logan? I mean, you look around at the facilities that we see across the conference these days. You look around at how facilities have improved at Mississippi State and Ole Miss. Ole Miss with the bowling in of the north end zone, the sparkling new pavilion at Ole Miss for basketball, a $96 million arena. You look at the enhancements at Davis Wade Stadium, the basketball practice facility there at Mississippi State that adjoins Humphrey Coliseum. You don't achieve these things. You cannot build these things without private contributions, without donations from alumni and friends and things of that nature. So how do you go about disciplining boosters like this? How do you bite the hand that feeds you, so to speak, or the hands? Those were some of the questions that I discussed recently with Ross Bjork and Jeff Vitter. Vitter said, frankly, that the contributions from the small number of boosters who have gone astray here, were not that significant. He feels like they can overcome the amount of money that they lose from the disassociation with certain boosters. So, frankly, they're very adamant about getting a handle on this. But again, the question is how. And what I heard was education and disassociation. It seems to be two extremes there, because you can educate boosters and still, even with the knowledge of what to do and how to do, the potential that some will choose to do the wrong thing and try to insert themselves into the program, into recruiting, that potential is still there. And for those, when that happens, it looks like the next option is disassociation. Right now, 12 boosters have been disassociated from the program. And this is where it varies a little bit. There are different levels of disassociation. There are 3 of those boosters right now who are disassociated for the length of the football team's probation, which is 3 years. And after that, you have others who are disassociated for an indefinite period of time. That means, theoretically, that these disassociated boosters certainly don't enjoy the perks that donors often enjoy, but beyond that, they can't buy tickets through the university. There's so many things they can't do. The university cannot accept monetary gifts from these boosters. Now, as far as the tickets and whatnot, and yes, they're banned from athletics venues and things of that nature. There are always other ways to acquire tickets, whether it's StubHub or just knowing somebody. And, so could these boosters show up at a venue? Probably. But, some of that gets kind of hard to police. But the disassociation of a donor, a contributor, a booster, that's an extreme measure. So that is how Ole Miss is going about dealing with its booster culture problem right now. Again, it doesn't believe it has a problem to the level that the NCAA says it does, but the administration is very clear that things need to change, and this is how they are going about working for change. First, education, then, if it becomes necessary, disassociation.
Yeah, and kind of going back to men's basketball, with Mississippi State that, talked earlier, just kind of the style of play. What's going on at Mississippi State right now, it seems that they can play defensively with anybody in the conference. They're one of the top defensive teams in the conference. Even the games that they're losing, they're holding the other team to lower than their scoring average. Last week against Arkansas, who was ranked number 22 at the time, just held them way below their scoring average, and Mississippi State was able to muster up enough points to beat Arkansas here at home. The problem is Mississippi State scoring points at all. That's the thing. They can stop other teams from scoring, but they can't score themselves. And for whatever reason, they're not passing the ball hardly at all. And Ben Howland just has to constantly remind the team to actually pass the ball. They get the ball across half court and they jack up a three, and they're not hitting their threes. And for whatever reason, they just continue to shoot threes, and they're not making them. They just up and they keep missing, and next time down the floor it's the same kind of thing. And that's kind of happened in all of their conference games so far. Even in the win against Arkansas, they did really well. In that second half, when they blew an 11-point lead against Ole Miss, missed 13 threes against Ole Miss. Didn't make a single three in that game, and that's what lost them the ball game. They just continued to put up empty trips down the floor, and they couldn't score. And that's the same thing that happened when they went to Florida the other night. Mississippi State made 5 threes during that ball game against Florida. Quindary Weatherspoon made 4 of those. They only got 1 3 from the other anybody else on the roster, but they continue to put up those threes. So, I asked Ben Howland about that. Looking at their shot selection on those 3-pointers, and most of them are open looks, and a lot of them are just kind of going in and out. But at the same time, eventually you've got to work the ball inside, and they were able to do that a little bit during the Florida game, but it was kind of too little too late when they realized that was happening. Abdul Abdu actually got a double-double. He was kind of really one of their bright spots in that game. He had 12 points and 10 rebounds. Quindary Weatherspoon had 16 points, but Mississippi State only scored 54 points against Florida. Had only scored 58 points in the game against Ole Miss. They held Florida to 71 points, held Ole Miss to 64 points, but they were both losses. And they play a good Auburn team this week, but Mississippi State's got to find a way to work the ball inside, share the basketball, look for the open pass and try to work the ball around and stop shooting so early in the shot clock. I mean, like I said, they're just kind of going down the floor and putting up a three and missing, and then running back down the floor to play defense, which is what they kind of do well. But eventually you got to score points. It doesn't really matter how many points you hold the other team to if that number is more points than your team can actually score. So that's kind of where Mississippi State's at right now. They're still a young team. They don't have a senior on the roster. scholarship senior on the roster. They have one walk-on that's a senior that, really doesn't play. But, right now they're a young team. They're still learning, but they've got to learn better than what they've done. They've kind of been beating their head up against the wall the last couple of games with the same mistakes over and over again.
Logan, did you watch the Florida game Wednesday night? I was actually driving back from Oxford during that time, caught some of it on the radio, but I'm wondering what you thought about the grad transfer, the Russian grad transfer from Rice, Igor Kukolov.
He scored, I think, the first 11 points for Florida. I listened to I was on the road too during the first part of that game. I actually listened to the radio broadcast of that from the tip through, I guess, maybe the first media timeout, and then I watched the rest of the game on TV. I actually had to watch the game on mute because apparently the SEC network had put a microphone right in front of the student section, and there was one particular student that just yelled the entire time Mississippi State had the ball. It was just kind of just an annoying sound, so I just had to mute it. It was that bad. It took away from the broadcast totally at all. It just was really, whatever. The tone of his voice was just annoying, but he continued to do it throughout the whole game. But just like I said, State just didn't play well. It's kind of it was the same thing they did. Ben Howland would call a timeout, and it was like he would remind Mississippi State to pass the ball. And whenever they would come out of the timeout, they would pass the ball for a couple of possessions, and then we would revert back to what they originally had been doing, which was just jacking up threes.
Folks, that's it for this edition of Double Coverage, our production of the Daily Journal. We thank you for clicking in with us today. Be sure to check out the Memo, our news podcast, all things Northeast Mississippi, that comes to you every Wednesday and Friday. And check out Prep Rally for all your high school sports needs. That's coming to you every Wednesday. And Logan and I will be back with you next Thursday or Friday for another round of Double Coverage.